It was one of those nights where the rain came down in sheets, hammering against the roof and windows with a relentless fury. I was driving home from a late shift at work, my eyes heavy with fatigue, but I knew the roads well enough to navigate them in my sleep. My old sedan struggled against the torrential downpour, the windshield wipers working overtime to keep the view clear. I turned onto the narrow country road that led to my house, the familiar path winding through dense woods. The dark, twisted branches of the trees formed an almost tunnel-like enclosure, their silhouettes flashing briefly in the car's headlights. The rhythmic swish of the wipers and the steady hum of the engine were almost hypnotic, lulling me into a state of semi-awareness. That's when I noticed it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a house that I had never seen before. It was an old Victorian mansion, its windows dark and its paint peeling, looking as if it had been abandoned for decades. The sudden appearance of such a structure in a place I had driven through countless times was jarring. Curiosity piqued. I pulled over to the side of the road, my tires sinking into the muddy shoulder. I got out of the car, the rain instantly soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. I approached the house, my footsteps squelching in the mud. As I got closer, I could see that the front door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. I hesitated, a sense of unease settling in my stomach. Every rational part of me screamed to get back in the car and drive away, but an inexplicable urge to explore overpowered my common sense. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight, casting a narrow beam of light into the shadows. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the rain pounding on the roof. I moved through the rooms, my heart pounding in my chest. The furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, the wallpaper peeling from the walls. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, abandoned in a hurry and left to rot. I reached the staircase and began to climb, the old wood creaking under my weight. At the top of the stairs, I found a long hallway lined with closed doors. I opened the first door on the left and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, facing a large window. I walked over to the window and looked out, but all I could see was the rain and the darkness. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The chair was empty, but the door was now closed. I felt a chill run down my spine. I crossed the room and opened the door, stepping back into the hallway. To my horror, all the other doors were now open. I shone my flashlight into the rooms, but they were all empty. I hurried back down the stairs, my heart racing. As I reached the bottom, I heard a loud bang from above, as if one of the doors had slammed shut. I didn't wait to find out what was happening. I ran out of the house and back to my car, my clothes soaked and my hands shaking. I drove home as fast as I could, my mind racing. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The next day, I went back to the spot where the house had been, but to my astonishment, it was gone. There was no sign that it had ever been there, no footprints in the mud, no tire tracks on the road. It was as if the house had vanished into thin air. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night, but I haven't driven down that road since. For weeks, the memory of the house haunted me. I found myself obsessively searching online for any mention of a Victorian mansion in the area, but there was nothing. No records, no old photographs, nothing that indicated such a house had ever existed. I even visited the local library, digging through archives and old maps, but my efforts yielded no results. The more I searched, the more elusive the house became in my mind. It felt like a dream, something my tired brain had conjured up in the midst of the storm. Yet, the fear I felt that night was real. The smell of decay, the oppressive silence, and the inexplicable changes in the house's interior were too vivid to dismiss as mere imagination. A month later, curiosity got the better of me again. Despite my fear, I decided to drive down that road once more. It was another rainy night, not as fierce as the one before, but enough to make me question my sanity for repeating the journey. I told myself I was just going for a drive, that I wouldn't stop, but deep down I knew I was looking for the house again. As I neared the spot where I had seen the house, my heart began to race. The rain pounded against the windshield, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. The bend in the road came into view, and I slowed down, peering through the rain-soaked glass. To my disbelief, there it was. The Victorian mansion stood in the exact same spot, looking as decrepit and eerie as before. My breath caught in my throat, and a sense of dread washed over me. This time, however, I wasn't just curious. I was determined to uncover the truth. I parked my car on the side of the road and stepped out, pulling my coat tightly around me. The rain was relentless, drenching me within seconds. I walked up to the house, the mud sucking at my shoes, and pushed open the door. The familiar musty smell hit me, and I shone my flashlight inside. The interior looked exactly as I remembered it. Dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I moved through the rooms, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything was the same, down to the single chair facing the window upstairs. This time, I was prepared. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting every room, every piece of furniture, every detail. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel the air grow colder, the silence more suffocating. I reached the hallway with the closed doors and hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the first door. I opened it and stepped inside, my flashlight revealing the same empty room with the chair. I quickly took a few pictures and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. My heart leaped into my throat, and I rushed to the door, yanking it open. The hallway was exactly as I had left it, all the other doors closed. I moved to the next door, my nerves frayed. As I opened it, I felt a cold draft, as if someone had walked past me. The room was empty, but the air was thick with an unexplainable presence. I quickly snapped a few photos and moved on to the next room. As I opened the third door, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of the rain. I froze, my flashlight beam shaking as I tried to locate the source of the sound. The room was empty, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. My blood ran cold as I realized the whispers were coming from all around me. Panic set in, and I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. I hurried down the stairs, my heart racing, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I reached the front door and stumbled outside, gasping for air. The rain felt almost purifying, washing away the fear that clung to me. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I had experienced. When I got home, I reviewed the photos on my phone. Every image was blurry and distorted, as if the camera had malfunctioned. The house looked like a smudge, a blur of shadows and light, offering no proof of its existence. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was an old house that appeared only during storms, a figment of my imagination brought to life by the darkness and rain. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something beyond my understanding. I haven't gone back to that road since. The fear and confusion that night left a mark on me, a lingering sense of unease that I can't shake. Sometimes, late at night when the rain is heavy and the wind howls, I think about the house. I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. And I wonder if they'll be as lucky as I was to leave with just a story and a few blurry photos. Because whatever it was, I'm certain it wasn't just an ordinary house. And some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was a typical rainy night when I decided to take a detour through the old part of town. The roads were slick and visibility was low, but I knew these streets well. As I navigated the narrow lanes, my car's headlights barely penetrating the downpour, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. The man was drenched, his clothes clinging to his body, and he looked utterly miserable. Feeling a pang of sympathy, I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I called out. He nodded gratefully and hurried over, opening the passenger door and sliding in. He was shivering and his face was pale, but he managed a weak smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I didn't think anyone would stop. I nodded and started driving again, the windshield wipers working furiously. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Just a little further down this road," he replied, his voice trembling. "My house is just up ahead." As we drove, I tried to make conversation, but he seemed reluctant to talk. He kept glancing out the window, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. After a few minutes, he suddenly spoke up. "You can drop me off here," he said, pointing to a dark, narrow lane that branched off from the main road. I glanced down the lane, but it was too dark to see anything. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It looks pretty deserted." He nodded. "It's fine. My house is just down there. Thank you for the ride." Reluctantly, I pulled over and watched as he got out of the car. He gave me a brief wave before disappearing into the darkness. I waited for a moment, half expecting to see some sign of life down the lane, but there was nothing. With a sigh, I put the car in gear and continued my way. The rain was still coming down hard, and the roads were nearly empty. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man standing there, but the road behind me was empty. A few minutes later, I rounded a bend and saw flashing lights up ahead. A police car was parked on the side of the road, its blue and red lights cutting through the darkness. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down my window as the officer approached. "Evening," he said, shining his flashlight into the car. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I replied, still feeling uneasy. "I just gave a guy a ride a few minutes ago. He seemed really out of it. I dropped him off down that lane back there." The officer's expression changed, his face growing serious. "What did he look like?" he asked. I described the man, and the officer's frown deepened. "You're sure it was him?" I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Why? What's going on?" The officer sighed and glanced back at his car. "We've been looking for that man for days. He went missing, and we found his car abandoned near that lane. No sign of him since." My heart skipped a beat. "But I just saw him. He got out of my car and walked down that lane." The officer shook his head. "That lane leads to an old, abandoned house. We've searched it top to bottom, but there's no sign of him." "Are you sure it was him?" I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "I'm sure." He was soaking wet and looked like he'd been out in the rain for hours. The officer nodded slowly. "We'll check it out again, but you should head home. It's not safe out here tonight." I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. When I got there, I locked all the doors and windows, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The next day, I checked the news, but there was no mention of the man or the police search. I couldn't let it go. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something supernatural was at play. The man's haunted expression, his reluctance to talk, and the officer's reaction all pointed to something beyond the ordinary. I decided to investigate further. I returned to the spot where I had dropped the man off, this time during the day. The rain had stopped, and the sun was trying to break through the clouds. The narrow lane looked even more desolate in the light of day. I parked my car and started walking down the lane, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The lane led to a dilapidated house, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. It looked like no one had lived there for years. I approached the house, feeling a sense of unease. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been the night I dropped the man off. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, casting a narrow beam of light into the shadows. The house was eerily silent, the only sound my own breathing. I moved through the rooms, my heart pounding in my chest. The furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, the wallpaper peeling from the walls. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, abandoned in a hurry and left to rot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I reached the staircase and began to climb, the old wood creaking under my weight. At the top of the stairs, I found a long hallway lined with closed doors. I opened the first door on the left and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, facing a large window. I walked over to the window and looked out, but all I could see was the overgrown yard and the darkening sky. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The chair was empty, but the door was now closed. I felt a chill run down my spine. I crossed the room and opened the door, stepping back into the hallway. To my horror, all the other doors were now open. I shone my flashlight into the rooms, but they were all empty. I hurried back down the stairs, my heart racing. As I reached the bottom, I heard a loud bang from above, as if one of the doors had slammed shut. I didn't wait to find out what was happening. I ran out of the house and back to my car, my hands shaking. I drove home as fast as I could, my mind racing. Over the next few days, I tried to put the experience out of my mind, but it haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the man and the abandoned house. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, the man's pale face and haunted eyes staring back at me. One night, I decided to do some research. I dug through old newspaper archives and local history websites, looking for any mention of the house or the man. What I found sent chills down my spine. Years ago, the house had belonged to a man named Henry Lawson. He was a recluse, rarely seen by the townspeople. Rumors circulated that he was involved in dark, mysterious practices, but nothing was ever proven. One stormy night, Henry disappeared without a trace. His car was found abandoned near the lane, but his body was never found. I couldn't help but see the parallels. The man I had picked up looked exactly like the old photographs of Henry Lawson. It was as if he had stepped out of time, still wandering the roads, trying to find his way home. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that I had encountered a ghost. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was overwhelming. I decided to visit the local historical society to see if they had any more information. When I arrived, the curator, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, welcomed me warmly. I told her about my experience, and she listened intently, her eyes widening as I described the man and the house. "You've seen Henry," she said softly. "You're not the first. Every few years, someone reports seeing him, always on a stormy night. They say he's looking for something, or someone, but no one knows what." I shuddered. "What do you think he wants?" Mrs. Harper shook her head. "I don't know, but I do know that he's restless, trapped between worlds. Maybe he needs someone to help him find peace." I left the Historical Society feeling more uneasy than ever. I didn't know how to help Henry, or if it was even possible, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I had been chosen for a reason. The old vacation home had been in our family for generations. Nestled deep in the woods by a tranquil lake, it was a place of cherished memories and peaceful retreats. However, there was one part of the house we always avoided: the attic. My grandmother used to tell us it was where our ancestors stored old family heirlooms, but there were whispers of strange occurrences that made it off limits. One summer, my siblings and I decided to spend a week at the vacation home. The first few days were blissful, filled with swimming, hiking, and late-night campfires. But as the week progressed, odd things began to happen. It started with small things. Objects would go missing and then reappear in strange places, and doors would open and close on their own. One evening, as we were gathered around the fireplace, we heard a loud thump from the attic. We exchanged uneasy glances, but dismissed it as an animal or the house settling. However, the noises continued, growing louder and more frequent each night. On the fourth night, curiosity got the better of us. We decided to investigate the attic. Armed with flashlights, we climbed the narrow staircase. The air grew colder as we ascended, and a sense of foreboding settled over us. At the top, we found a heavy, dust-covered door. It creaked loudly as we pushed it open. The attic was filled with old furniture, trunks, and boxes covered in cobwebs. As we explored, we found an old, ornate mirror leaning against the wall. Its surface was covered in dust, but as I wiped it clean, I felt a chill run down my spine. Reflected in the mirror was not just our group, but the faint outline of a woman standing behind us. We spun around, but the attic was empty. Unease settled over us as we decided to leave, but as we turned to go, the door slammed shut. Panic set in as we tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and our breath became visible in the cold air. The mirror began to fog up, and words appeared on its surface. "Help me!" We stared in horror, unsure of what to do. My sister, ever the brave one, spoke up, asking the spirit how we could help. The mirror fogged up again, this time revealing the words, "Find the locket." We began searching through the boxes and trunks, our hands shaking. After what felt like an eternity, we found an old, ornate locket in a small jewelry box. As we held it up, the room grew warmer, and the door to the attic creaked open on its own. We hurried down the stairs, clutching the locket. Once we were safely back in the living room, we examined it more closely. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman. We realized it must be the spirit from the attic, and she had been trying to communicate with us. The next day, we visited the local library to research the history of the house. We discovered that the young woman in the locket was our great-great-grandmother, Isabella. She had died tragically in the house, and her spirit had been trapped, unable to find peace. Determined to help her, we decided to give her a proper farewell. That evening, we held a small ceremony by the lake, placing the locket in the water and saying a prayer for her soul. As the locket sank beneath the surface, a sense of calm washed over us. For the rest of our stay, the house was peaceful. The strange occurrences stopped, and we felt a renewed connection to our family history. We left the vacation home with a newfound respect for the past and a sense of closure for Isabella's spirit.